Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 7. Aryn Decides. Gareth opened his eyes to the song of birds. His first thought was to make sure the sleeping form of his father had not disappeared into the fog of yet another fading dream. Carefully, he reached out with a finger to touch the bulging blanket next to him. It was silly, he told himself. Could he not hear the birds outside? Could he not see the mud walls, the fireplace, the scattered belongings about them? He was not in the dark dungeon any more. The collar. He reached for his throat. It was not there. They had taken it off. The exultation pooled in his chest. He could sing with it. There was a soft knocking on the door. Aryn sat up immediately. He shoved the blanket aside, covering Gareth with it, and gripped the blade next to him with one hand. The knock was repeated. Slowly he rose up and stepped into his boots. In 2 strides he was at the door. Peering through the cracks from outside were familiar eyes topped by a wrinkled brow and white hair. He smiled and pulled open the door. "Janos, come in." There was a frantic stir in the bedding behind him. Janos looked at the blade in his hand with caution.
"I would have slipped inside without knocking, but one can never be too careful when there is one of those things about. I would hate to get skewered after escaping from the Swamp Lord's clutches."
He sidled into the room, keeping his gaze fixed on the blade. Aryn shook his head, gave him a quizzical look, and placed the weapon in a corner. Gareth had freed himself from the blanket and came over in a stumbling rush. Janos gripped his shoulders to keep him from falling.
"Slowly now. You're not supposed to run about as yet."
"You escaped! You got away!"
Janos looked offended.
"Of course I did. Weren't you there? Didn't you see?"
Gareth grasped one of his hands and turned it over to look at the palm.
"I have to admit, there were times when I thought you weren't real, even after you left. But then I had the sacks and the candle. I'm so glad you're here."
Janos pulled away his hand and lifted his pack off his shoulders.
"So am I. It seems the time you spent down in that hole has addled your senses. But I have just the thing for that."
He rummaged through the bag to find his herbs, the smiling boy watching him all the while. Janos turned to Aryn, rolling his eyes.
"It is past sunup. You sleep soundly for a hunted man. Not that you don't deserve it."
"I would sleep even more soundly if I'm not poked every hour or so."
Gareth looked at him in amazement.
"You weren't sleeping? I didn't mean to."
"Forget it. I wake up for the slightest thing."
He turned away to get the fire going again. Hopefully Janos had not forgotten the supplies. He was about to mix the last of the flour for grit cakes. Gareth watched the old man crush dried leaves in his mortar.
"Where have you been all this time?"
Janos raised his eyebrows.
"What time? How long do you think since I left you behind to die alone in the dark?"
Aryn and Gareth looked up sharply, but Janos seemed not to notice.
"It has not even been a 10-day. I had many places to visit, and I had to find these."
He held up the mortar.
"If ever someone bold and sufficiently stupid would come along and get you out, was I not wise to wait?"
He rolled his eyes in Aryn's direction, who ignored him and continued his preparations. Janos brought a small pot out of his pack and poured the powdered leaves into it. He turned to Gareth.
"Water?"
The boy fetched the water skin and poured a small amount into the pot. Janos found a spot for it in the bed of coals.
"Just let it warm up a bit."
The smell of baking bread filled the room. All eyes turned to the cakes. Gareth ventured another question.
Did you go back there?
To my old home? No, I would have, but it is a long way off. I had to remain close to the marshlands, and the herbs I could not find anywhere. For that I had to go to the towers.
But you could move so quickly, anywhere you wanted to go. You moved through the stone walls of the dungeon.
What? Through the walls? You saw that?
Gareth shook his head as if he was about to admonish a little child.
Now, you know there was no way to get into my cell unless you came through the wall. How did you get out of the dungeons? You walked?
No, that much I can tell you. I crawled out through the veil, and that was no mean feat. It was only the writing on the stone marker that brought me there. That was the only thing I could remember clearly.
He cocked his head to one side. They spoke the words together.
Limit not your soul. Fear not the darkness.
Janos looked at him in amazement.
You have seen it?
Gareth nodded.
While I was in the dungeon, they took me to her, and she would try to steal into my head. They forced me to drink this oily stuff that made me sick. Then I would wake up in the veil, and Kale was there to chase her away.
Janos pursed his lips and frowned.
You can enter the veil without the portal, even when they had you collared.
He whistled through his teeth.
They are right to be afraid of you.
He pretended to be shocked.
I'm a little afraid of you.
Gareth shrugged.
I could go there, but not because I wanted it, and I couldn't stay unless I would wake up again where I had been before. I know it wasn't real, more like a dream. Like I was only there with my mind.
Janos' voice was low when he replied.
Only the 10 could do that at will. No one else ever entered there without passing through a portal. And then they entered not in thought, but in body, straining to keep their minds intact in that fearful, impossible place. The pathway between the gates was too much for many a sturdy warrior. It certainly wasn't a place for children.
Aryn interrupted them.
It may be prudent to have your breakfast before you pass through too many portals.
Janos stared at him uncomprehendingly. Then he glanced down at the hot grid cakes.
Yes.
He clapped his hands together.
Let us sit down and eat. I will tell you what a madhouse Myril has become.
Fell to with an appetite. Aryn watched the last of the honey disappear. He turned to Janos.
You remember to bring a few things to eat.
The old man nodded vigorously, speaking with his mouth full.
That I have.
Aryn was suddenly suspicious.
No rats.
Janos looked genuinely disappointed.
Sorry, no. I did not have the time to collect any.
Gareth made a face and glanced at Aryn, who quickly said,
No problem. Don't bring any on my account.
The boy thought it prudent to change the subject.
You were to the towers.
Janos licked a finger before replying.
I was, to get the herbs. Veer was a little surprised to see me.
He chuckled.
Fancy that, surprising someone who knows about everything.
You saw Veer.
Why not? He lives there, you know.
Aryn stared at them, shocked.
The Veer. Veer the Sear, whose statue stands in Belruth Temple.
Janos stared back, his hand suspended in midair.
Is there another one? I don't know about a statue. What have you been up to while I was gone?
Gareth could not contain his excitement.
Yes, it is the same Veer.
He turned to Janos.
There's a statue of the Winged Man in the underground temple in Belruth. They keep it there for their rituals, but they know nothing about it.
Janos looked nonplussed.
Does he approve of this?
Gareth shook his head.
Of course not, but he is no longer part of their ceremonies and rites. He lives alone in the towers as Kenath the Keeper. After the summoning, the Viron outlawed the art, and the initiate's course was abandoned. This was part of Malik's scheming. Kale became an exile, and Vir too, in a way.
Aryn listened with growing interest. At last all the clues were making a coherent whole. Malik's master plan was clear to him now. Janos' next words echoed his thoughts.
I see where this is leading. I have wakened at the end of Malik's intrigue. No wonder Vir was so adamant that I discover what has transpired.
He sat back and wiped his fingers on his shirt.
I have much to tell you. But first,
He pointed to the little pot now steaming on the fire.
those herbs need to be swallowed.
Gareth needed no greater incentive than the news from the towers. He gripped the vessel with a rag and lifted it to his lips. The contents was hot, but not scalding. He took a breath and gulped it down as fast as he could. Janos stared at this display, winking at Aryn.
There now, you know what it will take to make him swallow anything.
They laughed as he set down the empty pot and wiped his mouth with a sleeve. Janos motioned him closer and proceeded to undo the bandage round his neck, talking all the while.
The swarm is all the way up into Viron. Store is gone. So is Gerdel. Even Ingerval on the coast is threatened. All of Ligerium has disappeared, except for a few villages in the east and Varus on the shore. The filthy sea ravens have joined the slaughter, or I should say the plundering, and are picking everything clean after the beasts passed through.
Where are the armies of Ligerium and Nuria?
Aryn interrupted. Janos looked at him with large eyes and hesitated.
There was a big battle outside Store. Fengor faced off against Turik for the control of Ligerium.
What? Aryn could not believe his ears. The fools!
Yes, the fools. But they never had the opportunity to grab each other by the beards. The swarm came upon them there and destroyed the whole lot. Only the prince got away, running for his life to Belruth.
Aryn suddenly realized what the old man was saying.
Fengor is dead. And Turik?
Dead and gone, swallowed up. Also that Quester fellow. Quester, what a quaint appellation.
Quester Talon?
The same.
Aryn and Gareth stared at each other. Neither could find a word to say. The world they had known, with the people in it, was fast disappearing. In a few moments the shadows and threats of the past had been rendered meaningless. In their place was growing a single looming oppression, the Lord of Tiralon.
But there is much more. A massive force of barbarians from the south have overrun Aryn Inrath in the Witch Sea. I am not too sure where that is exactly. Apparently, Kale was hiding there after that calamity you call the summoning. Then they invaded Aryn.
Gareth felt the shock pass through him like a chill, setting his body trembling. Aryn had expected this news. He was the first to react.
But Kale was not there.
No, he went north to see Vir and guard the portal veil without being in reach of the invaders.
Gareth spoke in a whisper.
What about Hanik and Bior and the others?
Most of Kale's men escaped. They were taken off by the Arynites. I forget the name of their sea captain. It's E something.
Ivrain?
That's the one. And it proved a wise thing to help them. Kale's men helped the Arynites in return to beat off the attack of the thousands of barbarians at the Black River and the Rock. No doubt he's trying to buy their favor to help Viron. Malik's armies will head up there soon to mop up whatever the swarm has left.
Aryn nodded in agreement.
I have seen his forces gathered in Lakeside. I do not know how Nuria could resist them even in its strength. With the host already destroyed.
He shrugged.
And there is at least one dragon at Malik's command.
Dragon?
Janos sounded incredulous.
You mean a fire breather? Like in the days of Fenwith?
I saw it in the south. Whether it breathes fire, I cannot tell you, but it does not need to. That thing will plow through a wall of shields as if through straw.
Janos snorted disdainfully.
Without the art it will. It seems that Malik holds all the advantage, and in an overwhelming way.
The tidings were depressing indeed. All three sat locked in their own morose contemplations for a while. Soon enough Aryn got up to have a look around outside. Janos accompanied him, since there were a number of marshland edibles he wanted to show him. Gareth was ordered to remain indoors, but he had other ideas. As soon as the men left, he retrieved the clothes Aryn had brought from Fenvale, washed up and dressed. He had to get out and see the sun for himself. It felt like ages since he had had the pleasure. Besides, all the information brought by Janos had to be digested under the wide expanse of the sky, and not in a little hovel. It was easier to think things through outside. He had been a prisoner long enough. A few wispy clouds floated by on a light breeze. The noonday sun was warm and inviting, touching the little pools and shady bogs till they glistened like jewelry. The marshland birds called to one another and flitted from one grassy thicket to another. Gareth found a sandy spot to sit down with legs outstretched, and, propping himself up with his arms, turned his face up to the sun. He could almost feel the deck of the sun sway moving underneath him, and the friendly voices of the Myrddin singing in low tones as they sorted the catch into the bins. How good it was to breathe the free air again. He thought of Aryn and the wars across the sea. Garth was in Aryn now, bargaining for aid. Had they met? Did they get along? Anyone would like Aryn. The rushes parted behind him, and he looked round, startled. Janos and Aryn stood there, smiling, holding up a bunch of bulbs and roots. They came over and stood in his sunlight.
He doesn't listen too well, does he?
Janos remarked.
No, he doesn't. Been his own master for too long now.
He looked up at their gloating faces, ignoring the jest.
Shall I let Lord Garth know where we are?
Janos frowned, then remembered.
Oh, Cale, you mean? You can speak to him?
He smiled.
Of course you can.
Aryn said nothing. Let the boy tell Garth what happened. No doubt he could do with some good news. They left him to it, trudging back to the cooking fire with their pickings. Gareth leaned back to rest his head on his folded arms and closed his eyes. The warm sun was a blanket over his body and face. He knew that somewhere in the vicinity of Aryn Rock, the old man was waiting for his touch. Garth made his way back to the waiting boat. A heaviness descended upon him, stealing away every hopeful consideration. He had to admit it, final defeat was staring him in the face. Not that overcoming Malik in this game would bring him any satisfaction. He had stooped too low already, had lost too many things that had real value, to savor a hollow victory over the likes of the Shadow. There was no way to heal the breach. He stood alone still, after all his efforts. Veer was locked in his mountain. Nuria cursed the memory of the summoner, as did Aryn. Aryn had slipped away from him, as had Gareth, Elena. Again he had seen it confirmed in the hall of Ranald that afternoon. He told himself that there had been no choice in the matter. Mistake or not, he could not deceive these people into striving against Malik and joining with their enemies across the pass. He would not play games with their trust and manipulate them for his gain, only to sacrifice them when it suited him. If Aryn went to war for the sake of the Viron, it had to be of their own volition. If they went to war, why would they? The invasion had been beaten off, Aryn was safe for the time. What would convince them to venture forth to the aid of their enemy? He stared out to sea, listening to the rhythmic pull of the oars. What a comfort it was to have his own men about him. Here was trust, implicit and sure. He had earned it by his actions on their behalf. Would that the aid given the Arynites could bring the same reward. One thing was sure. The lines were drawn, the lots cast. All he could do was move forward and trust that it would be sufficient to meet the challenge. Everything he had at his disposal was committed. Nothing remained but to hope in things he could not control. It was a strange sensation for one who needed to have the reins firmly in his grip, much like the fear and awe he had felt first at hearing the lament. There was a tide that would take them all to a destination obscure and unpredictable. The players were beyond his power to direct, the events too tempestuous to forestall. A baneful child, hide him from the hooded man. He had not hidden him. Instead, he had allowed him to be taken into the very lair of evil. Was it a mistake? How would he ever know? A touch. The familiar formulation and awareness of another time stole into his mind as if desire and regret alone had brought it. He grasped at it, holding it as a fragile, delicate flower against the keening wind.
Gareth?
Lord Karth, you are sad.
No, relieved, and tired perhaps. Where are you? I see your thoughts so clearly.
I no longer have the collar. Aryn is here with me, in the swampland, where we are hiding. And Janos, who I met in the dungeons. We are safe. I want to tell you, it was worth waiting. It was worth going back. My dream has come true.
Even out on the other side of the sea, with the wind blowing in his hair, Karth felt the surge of pure joy and satisfaction. He was smiling at the sun, the wild seabirds, the flying spray. The charm was holding still against all odds. I am happy for you. Who is Janos?
Janos of Lavinium, the physician. He was taken before the summoning.
Janos, gods of Myrol. He had not turned traitor after all. The news was a ray of hope. All this time? He was in Lakeside all this time?
He was. They took his memories, and he was a little crazy, I think. He's mostly fine now, though. He doesn't know much about what has happened. He hates Malik. I think he will be on our side.
Their side. Yes, they had a war to win, and every ally counted. I am glad to hear it. What will you do now?
I want to come to you. I want to be with you and Aryn and Anik. I will bring Rune with me.
Karth considered this for a moment. He knew what should happen next. Gareth, you should not come to Aryn, though I would love to have you here. I owe you so much already. You have to persuade him to go to the towers. There is a gate in Arywis, but it has been overrun by the swarm, and the sea ravens hover close by. Perhaps it is easier to find the gate in Lakeside. How far are you from the city?
Not far. 2 hours or so.
If you wait for Malik's force to leave, there will be few guards in Lakeside. There was a hesitation. Gareth was looking for a reason for Karth's instruction. Oddly, the memory of Veer's alarmed face on the snowy mountainside of Nuria loomed up before him. There was danger ahead, unfathomable but real. Fear gripped him. Suspicion swirled through his mind. Once again, Karth would not tell him all. Where would this pathway lead? Perhaps if he thought hard enough, he would hear the answer.
Lord Karth, the man has turned, and I know it was for your purpose. What will you do with him now? Will he have to be sacrificed? Will he have to die also?
What was there to say? Should he give hope where there was no certainty?
One cannot escape the purpose one was born for. The blessing lies in whether it is a noble purpose or not.
I do not want him to die.
Neither do I. It is not written anywhere. We can only hope that when the sun rises again, we will be able to bear the loss or enjoy the gift of what remains with us.
Garth watched the sun go down behind the mountains of Aryn. He stood on deck till long after the dark had fallen, watching the lights along the shore. So much depended on what was decided in the morning. Would fear and ingrained suspicion prevail, or had they done enough to break down the walls of age-old conditioning? Vanold was a wise man for his cycles. Would that he was wise enough to seize the only opportunity to be presented to him. The fire was burning low, casting vague shadows on the walls of the hovel. Dinner had been a feast, with Janos at the helm and a variety of marsh vegetables added. A comfortable silence descended. Aryn stared into the flames, sifting through the many thoughts invoked earlier that day by the tidings of the world outside. It was hard to grasp that Fingor was no more. The hate, the persecution and spite that had been his life for so long had no more foundation. A frightening void opened up beneath him. Had he not turned from the destructive course he had been on, had he not found the consolation of discovering Aethera's secret, this quirk of fate might have cost him his already wavering reason. Myril and his place in it had changed overnight. He would have to find a new direction. Next to him, Gareth stirred and voiced his own disturbing thought.
I told you about the shepherd boy in Belruth. The one who died in my place, Riot. He was the son of my mother and the king. If she had not cheated on him to have me, he would have been the prince. Fingor would have loved him. He would have been happy. I took his rightful place and condemned him to live as an outcast. Then I gave him the girdle and they took him like that. I killed him that day as I'd stolen his life all along. Do you think there is a place where I could make up for that?
Aryn sighed heavily. If he knew anything, it was regret. But his regrets were born of willful, deliberate action, not the accidents of fate.
You did not kill him. Not by anything you could have prevented.
I did kill him. Not only with a gift, but he would have been a prince of Nuria, had it not...
That was not your doing. That sin is reckoned to me and your mother, and to Fengor himself, who should not have separated us. Were you not a friend to him? Was it not his own father who traded him as he would trade you? Do not burden yourself on his account. The transgression and the guilt belong to others.
The boy stared at him pleadingly.
Do you really believe that?
He could meet and hold the gaze.
I do.
Gareth looked back at the flickering flame, seemingly satisfied. He remembered what Garth had asked of him.
Where will you go from here?
Aryn pondered this for a while before answering.
I don't know. East, perhaps. Far away from these cursed lands.
Gareth sighed deeply. The silence between them grew heavy. Aryn was puzzled by the boy's eagerness to join the hopeless struggle in the north, and even more mystified that he himself would even consider this insanity as a possible course of action. What would be gained by it? At length he simply said,
I cannot stop the swarm, Gareth.
The reply came swiftly, in full assurance.
I know of one who can. and who can tell you what you need to do for Viron.
Oh no, I've had enough of Karth, and I'm sure he has had enough of me.
Gareth was shaking his head vigorously. He put a hand on Rune's arm as if to prevent him from speaking.
It's not Karth. It's Veer of the Towers.
Janos spoke up as if to corroborate the suggestion.
If one wishes to see the whole picture and then make a decision, that is the place to go. You will certainly be out of harm's way there. It is a vast, deserted realm, no longer of importance to anybody.
Rune seemed skeptical.
To get out there, one would have to cross the length of the eastern shore, through the devastated lands. The sea is not safe.
But there is a portal in Eruis.
Gareth's voice betrayed his excitement. Rune had not refused outright. He was simply finding excuses.
We could go through Finvale.
And the swarm.
Rune interjected. Gareth scowled at him, but Janos came to the boy's rescue.
There is also a portal in Lakeside. I know where he has hidden it, and I know what he is doing to guard it. If you want to go to the towers, that is the quickest and safest way.
And the host?
Janos shrugged.
We'll get our gallant Vadran to scout and keep a lookout on the city. When Malik departs, we wait a day or two and slip back in. In the meantime, we will get our rest and gather our strength for the days to come. I am simply dying to see what my traps have caught. Tomorrow will be a big day.
With that, he rolled himself in his blanket and, mumbling several times, went to sleep. A tiny snoring sound soon rose up from his motionless form.
It is decided then,
said Rune.
as soon as you can move about again.
I can already move about.
Gareth pretended to be offended.
Oh, yes, well, don't move so far that you run into Malik's men. I would hate to go back down there to drag you out again.
The boy actually stuck out his tongue. Rune waved a finger at him.
If your head wasn't about to fall off, I would wring your scrawny neck.
They laughed so loudly that Janos sat up and wished them a speedy journey to the pit. Rune was about to announce that Gareth was ready to move right away, but thought the better of it. Too much jesting did not encourage a good night's rest. King Melucane looked out over his battlements to the approaches below. The dreaded, loping shapes had appeared over the far horizon at last. Yet he feared them not as before, not here in the fastness he had known and trusted all his life. Here they would be stopped, defeated, annihilated. He had time to prepare for their arrival, time to set traps and trails of deceit, time to mobilize and equip every last inhabitant. Even the questers had been pressed into the garrison. Their lives were suddenly no more important than the rest. Pits had been dug, stakes raised, all the people from farms around brought inside the walls. More importantly, he knew what drove them now, what spurred these beasts to scale walls and charge steel spears. The smell of blood, the raging appetite and fierce competition for nourishment. All the livestock of Belruth, with a few exceptions, had been driven off in the direction of Tew and the road east. Instructions were given to tether a number of them at intervals of half a mile or so. The trail of meat would lead a large number of swarmlings away from his gates and on towards Gilreth. Let the good folks of Tew see to their own safety. Let the traitor of Gilreth deal with the swarm for a change. He had opted out of joining the host at Store, Now let him pay the price of treason. The long column approached. It was terrifically strong still, 25,000-30,000 at least, a swirling mass of claws and fangs. From his vantage point it was clear who the leaders were. A full head taller than their fellows, they seemed to inspire changes in pace or direction among the others. He pointed these out to his best marksmen. The order went out to light the fire arrows. Timing was critical. If he could keep the swarm frustrated behind the burning pitch, they might just decide to head after the bloody trail he had left for them. They were among the houses of the outer town, milling about a little, breaking through doors and windows of the abandoned structures. As soon as the first creatures emerged on the other side, he gave the order to loose the arrows. The missiles arched away to their destinations. Almost instantly, a wall of flames sprang up all the way round the curtain wall, in places reaching as high as 20 feet. Only a few swarmlings were caught in it, setting up a horrible screeching as they were set alight. The rest halted or retreated back among the buildings. Lucain watched with satisfaction. Only now did he realize that the structures of the town would have supplied him with even more fuel for his protective wall of fire. Quickly, he ordered more arrows sent into the town in an attempt to set the number of the thatched roofs aflame. Time wore on. The flames diminished gradually, leaving black scars on the ground. Lucain kept an anxious eye on the crowding creatures. They had spread out to surround the entire city, yet the rear of the column still bulged outside on the southern road. At last, a portion seemed to drift eastwards in the direction of Tew. Soon the trickle became a flood. Relief washed over him as he saw them go. They had caught the scent of his sacrifice.
Farewell.
He thought.
Give my best wishes to the Count. May he be brave enough to come out and fight them. May he fall like my father did, torn and bloody beneath the hordes.
When finally the flow slowed to a few stragglers, more than half the creatures were heading away from Belruth. The ruse had given them a fighting chance. Still, the swarmlings that remained were too numerous to assault and drive off. These now stood watching the wall in sinister silence, as if rooted to the spot, hardly moving a muscle. The pitched arrows, driven by a light breeze, reached their targets in the town, and fires were soon blazing everywhere. The creatures retreated grudgingly, pressing into the gaps where no buildings stood, even crowding the old ruins north of the castle. From there they continued their staring vigil, filling every gap among the broken masonry, except for a section round the old gateway in the center. Lucain moved the bulk of his defenders round to the north to face them. This was where the fire would disappear first, the place for the initial assault. He had witnessed the ferocity and speed of that attack before. His men were warned and ready. There was nowhere to run. Their survival was at stake. Lucain was encouraged to see so many scarlet surcoats on the wall with him. He had brought back perhaps a dozen guardsmen from Store. The young royal guards, those in training still, had not been sent out with the king at the beginning of Genesis. Now he was glad of it. They were sorely needed for the defense. At last the flames in the north dissipated. The men raised their bows. There were final shouted instructions from the sergeants. The first swarmling to leap the pits, the rush was on. The arrows streamed down into the pressing ranks, felling dozens. One more flight scythed through the horde before they reached the base of the fortifications. A chorus of clicking sounds rose up to the men as the claws scraped over the rough stones of the wall. The creatures surged upwards in hundreds. Boys and women joined the men to drop stones over the side in an effort to dislodge some of the attackers. All too soon, the swarmlings gained the top, reaching over the crenellations, pulling themselves up and over. The savage hand-to-hand fighting commenced. From the towers alone, the rain of arrows continued unabated. The men on the wall struck in desperation, the horror of the swarm driving them on. Blacksmith and soldier, kitchen boy and chimney sweep. Slowly, the swarmlings gained a foothold on the wall. Lucane watched in dismay as his men started falling to the scourge. Was there no stopping these horrors? They did not experience fear and would not relent till struck down. The defenses were wavering. Not half an hour had passed. He cast a small reserve into the fray. If the wall was overrun here, it mattered not that they held it elsewhere. At last the attack seemed to be faltering. The targeting of the leaders was paying off. More and more beasts were milling about at the base of the wall without purpose or direction. Wounded swarmlings were actually retreating. Lucane felt the sweat trickle over his brow. There was an end to their resolve, and wiping out the instigators helped them reach it sooner. The strange noise rose up from the creatures now, almost a wail, as they dropped from the battlements or off the wall to head back to the rubble. A ragged cheer broke from the defenders, and the archers ceased their barrage, sagging down to rest their weary limbs. The ground below the wall was strewn with bodies, maybe 1,000 of them, unmoving and broken. Belruth would not fall this day, even if the danger was far from over. Messengers came in one after the other, 3 in all, on the 22nd day of Genesis. Malvor received them in the council room, with Haldred in attendance. He adjusted his map each time, and returned to pore over it as soon as the scout was dismissed. The first new information came from Nimona and the east. The swarmlings had reached that town, but were defeated. He removed the copper coin from the eastern parts of Estium. The men of that region also remained loyal to Trigoran. They had no tidings of Turic, but had seen him depart for the border with Nuria. Malvor felt a surge of hope. The Ligurian and Nurian hosts combined would be able to make a stand against the swarm. Another messenger arrived from the west, bearing grim tidings indeed. The towns of Duraco and Gades had been sacked. Most of the people from the latter had managed to escape to Varus, however. That city was surrounded by swarmlings, but had not fallen to an assault. Again he removed the coin, this time one of the 3 concentrated on Varus. Lastly, the long-awaited scout from the south arrived. His report was no less disturbing, if more urgent. There was no sign of Malik's forces as yet. Hikan Sear was in Nicoma, however. His men were taking their time plundering that town. Disaster had befallen the scouting party. One of their number was taken by Hikan's men. He would reveal the position and strength of the refugees before long. It was imperative that they leave Amorous as soon as possible. Malvor moved the penholder representing Hikan's force to Nicoma. It appeared to be startlingly close to their position now. Certainly it was time to move out of the way. Only one question remained, east or west. Haldred watched the new unfolding disposition of threats on the map. An encouraging gap appeared in the east. The copper coins were all concentrated on Varus or Store. The woodlands around Nimona seemed inviting. These people also belonged to her father and not the treacherous count. They would be welcomed among them. The west coast seemed fraught with danger. Sea ravens lurking off the coast or plundering Arois. The 2 coins still on Varus and another coin inland on Gades. The last consideration was Hikan Sear in Nicoma. He would most certainly move northwards to Amorous, ahead of his master. Where would he go from there? If he decided to proceed to Store, Nimona would be a good destination. But what if he headed there first? The defenders would not stand up to him. They would be forced to flee into the forest again, while their town and livelihood were plundered. The fiend might even hunt them down. And if Hekan ignored the place, Malik would not. Nimona was doomed to be ground under one heel or another. Lingering in the east would place the enemy between them and their only allies in the north. The risk in the west appeared even greater at first glance. There were still swarmlings about, in numbers sufficient to overcome their band with ease. The sea ravens were unpredictable, but they would not strike at Varus while there was a chance that they might encounter swarmlings on the outskirts of the city. Their greed would eventually drive them to make an assault on the sun-tide palace of the Ligurian king. In any event, Arus would be deserted at this stage, both by the swarm and the plundering pirates. Malik would not bother sending a force to the fallen city. Hekan would stay away for lack of loot. It might be the safest place to weather the storm, or even find a ship to take them up the coast to Nuria. Aldred pointed to the abandoned city of Arus.
What would you say to going west instead of east?
Malvor glanced at where she was pointing. He frowned heavily.
You would risk running into the sea ravens.
Nimona would be invested. You know that. If not by Hekan, then certainly by Malik. We will be pushed into the forest with no sustenance and a difficult route into Nuria. We may be pursued. It will be too much for the children and older ones.
Yes, you are right about that. Nimona is within reach of the advancing hosts. Arus has no more value to them. But what will we do once we reach there?
We could advance with caution to join the defenders of Varus, or we could try to sail for Nuria.
You would run the gauntlet through Raven-controlled waters.
I would rather face the cowardly sea ravens than Malik's hordes, or Hekan's for that matter.
Malvor's gaze fixed on the stacks of coins on store.
I need to find out what is happening in the north. If we could stay ahead of Hekan, that is the most direct route.
Aldred shook her head.
I doubt we could move fast enough. We will need to carry supplies. That means carts, and since we no longer have draft animals, we will have to pull them ourselves. Hekan's scouts will overhaul us ere long, and if the swarm remains in store, we will have nowhere to run.
Malvor's hand moved to his chin.
That seems to be the case. Perhaps we should part our ways then. I will depart up the northern road to Nuria, while your father can lead the refugees to Arus.
Aldred considered this. Losing Malvor and his Nurians would drastically reduce their ability to defend themselves.
I will be sad to see you leave us, Captain, but I can make no further demands on your goodwill. You have brought us thus far and protected us from many dangers. All the survivors owe you a great debt.
An urgent knock prevented Malvor's reply. Fabian brought an exhausted man into the room. Malvor recognized him as the last of the 3 scouts sent out to the south. From the man's expression, he could see that something important had transpired.
What is it? What's the matter?
Captain, sir, the men from the waste are advancing up the road to Ambrose with all haste. They must have learned about us from all Mu was taken.
How close?
2 hours, maybe 3. I came as quick as I could.
Great Imran's wrath! This is a disaster.
Malvor turned to Fabian.
Find every half-baked soldier we have and assemble them in the courtyard.
He met Aldred's shocked gaze.
Let your father know what has happened. We need to get everyone moving westwards as quickly as possible. I will march our troops south to delay the advance. Take what supplies are at hand and depart with all haste.
He rushed from the room on the heels of the 2 men. Aldred hesitated for a moment only. Quickly she pulled the map from the table, scattering cups, inkpots, and coins over the floor. It would not do to leave behind any indication of where they would run to. She hoped fervently that Hekan's greed would keep him in Ambrose, while the poor refugees made for the coast. She ran for the door to the inner chambers. With any luck, Hassar would be with the king. Hunnick was amazed to find his master so altered after one night's repose. The gloom and heaviness of the day before had departed entirely, and in their place was left a cheerful confidence for which he had no way of accounting. Lord Carth even smiled at him over the breakfast table. For a moment he thought that perhaps all the strain of the last 10 days had caused the old one's mind to slip. It was only when informed, almost casually, in the boat out to the rock, of Rune and Gareth's escape from Nun Merrick, that he joined in the new mood of optimism. He went as far as to embrace the startled Beor and yell his delight above the roar of the waves, sending the gulls flapping away to safety. Of course, the tall Beoran shared in his exuberance, but Beor thought the display a little undignified. The sudden change in humor proved infectious once they landed on the rock. Even the guards stared at the broadly smiling party, who but yesterday had departed under a somber cloud. Ranald noticed it, as did Aryn and the king's vassals. As soon as the Inrathians entered the room, the dark suspicions and terrible truth of the day before were pushed back, and something of the camaraderie and mutual respect of their shared triumph surfaced once more. Aryn suspected immediately what tidings could have wrought such a transformation in the demeanor of these men. He ignored the protocols demanded by diplomacy and the seriousness of the situation, and rushed forward to greet the smiling group. Hunnick gripped both his hands, a boyish smile of glee fixed on his face. He spoke under his breath.
The swine has done it. Rune has stolen Gareth away from the monster. It is the greatest miracle, and one we have not dared to hope for.
That is the best of news.
Aryn could hardly believe it. He had sensed the resignation the day before when they had told him of the boy's capture. It had been as if the men were mourning him already. The heaviness had taken root in him also, to such a degree that he believed Gareth beyond aid. Behind him, Ranald cleared his throat. Aryn nodded to the Inrathians before returning to his seat, a conspiratorial grin on his face. Curious glances followed him. As soon as he sat down, he felt a tap of Ranald's finger on his arm. He was obliged to lean over and whisper the news in the king's ear. He saw the smile spreading. Even the wise Ranald had fallen under that boy's spell. The king rose up to pronounce his welcome and stipulate the reasons for their gathering. Aryn glanced over at Carth. He hardly heard a thing Ranald was saying. Cale, the summoner, sat across the table from him, and he was not the monster he had been made out to be. He could not be, when he was so obviously pleased at the salvation of a child. Aryn's thoughts wandered back to the day before. What was it he had said? Fengor was not Gareth's father. Who was it then? He remembered that night on the road when they had confronted the boy and caught him in a lie. He had admitted to being the prince, even as he had renounced Fengor as his father. Since he was a prince, there could be only one person apart from Fengor who could have made him thus, the exile. More memories crowded in. One stood out among them, the long look of envy from Rune in that very council room when Gareth had rushed forward to embrace a foreigner and an enemy. A dangerous man, he had felt it, even then. If anyone could bring a prisoner out of the dungeons of Nun Merrick, it was he. Carth rose up to reply to the king's opening statement. Some of the solemn aspect of the day before returned to his features.
I thank you, as I have before, for the willingness to listen to my side of the drama. I am not here to excuse myself or justify the summoning. I repent of it, the motives that brought it on, which were selfish and arrogant, and the pride that would not admit defeat, but rather destroy all than submit. The summoned were indiscriminate in what they consumed, friend and foe alike, ally and enemy. I could not control them, could not undo what I had done. That is my crime, my burden, for which no atonement can be made. But there are crimes I am blamed for which I did not commit. Perhaps the most significant of those is the massacre of the Arynite prince and his men outside the gateway in Belruth. I had nothing to gain from such a dastardly deed. In fact, it robbed me of the aid I sorely needed. Those men were my allies, come to face the swarm with me. What madness would drive me to slaughter them and bring the enmity of Aryn down on my head? The summoning was an act of desperation, foolish and rash, yes, but a calculated risk. There is no sense in the massacre. I had, and have, no reason to make war on Aryn. Who then, you ask, is responsible? Recent developments should bring a name to everyone's lips. Someone who desired the downfall not only of Aryn, but all the kingdoms of the north. Someone who gained immensely from the rift between Viron and Aryn. Malek of Tiralan, whose noose was drawn so tight that it brought me to that unthinkable crime. I have aided you against this man's onslaught, not because I love Aryn, but because I need Aryn. Still, be assured this day that I do not hate Aryn, nor have I ever desired its destruction or subjection. I most vehemently deny any involvement in the massacre, and the summoning that caused more deaths among your countrymen I acknowledge as a terrible crime, though it was not aimed at the men of Aryn in particular.
Garth paused for a moment to scan the solemn faces. Most men were willing to meet his eyes. Every one of them seemed to be considering what was said. He continued,
You may think that the choice lies between Malek and Kale, but there is another option. You can choose to march to the aid of Viron simply to defeat that tyrant of the marshes. Your old adversary, already brought low by the swarm, has not the strength today to defend itself against the invaders from Tiralan, and will surely fall. If you do not act, and simply remain here to protect your borders, there will be no one to stand with you when his legions cross the pass to enslave your children. I will lead my band to battle in Uria. There I will conquer or be destroyed utterly. That hour has arrived for me. There will be no dark sorcery on my side. I will strive with what I have, and the men who are bound to me. The evil of the Marsh Lord will have to break us before it can hold sway. I have aided you to ensure that Aryn is still strong. You cannot defeat the coming horde as you did the barbarians. Today you have to choose, to march to war and the aid of your enemy, or wait for it to come to you alone. If you march, there are more than Inrathians to join with you.
He pointed a finger at Ranald.
As you know, Count Byrand of Gilreth did not heed the summons of his king to muster in Stol. The soldiers of his realm have trained in secret these many seasons to regain their lost art and find again the power to defeat the swarm.
The eyes of all assembled now rested on Ranald, who shifted a little uncomfortably. To have his secret negotiations with the supposed enemy exposed so abruptly was not to his taste. Garth spoke on as if he did not notice this at all.
The Viron of Gilreth have opposed the war with Aryn for many cycles. These will stand with you. Even the Vaedren of the Hand, increased in numbers by their kin from Fenvale, are prepared to support us. Yet they will not fight unless Aryn marches. They will hide till overcome one by one in isolation. If Aryn does not march, there is little hope of prevailing against the evil from Tiralan.
Garth took one more look around the table and sat down. Silence descended on the pensive gathering. Ranald rose to his feet.
Lord Kale, we have heard your words and will discuss your proposal this day. A place for repose has been prepared for you and your men in the tower. Please wait for us there, that we shall give you an answer before the sun is set.
The Inrathian delegation stood up. Garth led them from the room in silence. All the eyes followed them out. Anik sighed as he sat down on the cushioned bench in their tower room. There was a magnificent view over the bay and the harbor of Aryn town. Refreshments had been prepared and placed on a table for them, but he hardly glanced at it. So much depended on the opinion of the men Karth had addressed in the council room. What qualities did they possess that had brought them to such a place of decision? Did the fate of the peoples of the inland sea rest in the hands of those few with their weaknesses and prejudice? He had seen enough of Ranald to trust the king's judgment, but the nobles made no such impression on him. He turned to Beor and Karth.
Will Ranald's decision be that of the council?
Karth replied after securing a morsel from one of the plates.
That is hard to say. There are many voices in that room, many opinions. If he favors our cause, he will have to persuade those opposed to it.
Beor spoke up. I thought he was a king in the old way.
Even a king has to respect the will of his subjects. He will make himself very unpopular otherwise. We have to have won more than just Ranald's favor.
Anik stretched out his legs. His face was a mask of concern.
What did you make of them? Do you think they believed what you said?
They would be fools not to believe their own experience. Malek has made a bid to wipe them out. There is no denying that. In the end, it is not that important that they believe me innocent of the massacre. As long as there is doubt, Malek has proven that he could be responsible. They cannot side with him. All they have to decide now is whether they can trust us sufficiently to side with us.
They would have to be fools not to, Beor interjected. After experiencing the scale of Malek's resolve, any and every ally should be embraced at once.
Karth nodded. Yet they are struggling with the deep hatreds and suspicions of the past. It may take them a few hours to see reason.
Anik reached for one of the baskets set before them.
We might as well be comfortable while we wait.
Aldred ran her fingers over the silken gown spread out on her bed. She sighed to think that she would have to leave them behind. Immediately she felt ashamed for entertaining such trivial considerations, while every moment passing brought them closer to captivity or death. There was no room in her bag for taking these garments. With no pack animals but themselves, provisions and arms were the first priorities. Again, she would have to make do with as little as possible. Hekan's Sear, like a lingering disease, was the cause of her tribulation once more. Kira appeared in the doorway. Her eyes fell on the garments, and she almost forgot what she had come to say.
Princess Haldred, everyone is assembled in the courtyard. It is time to go.
Haldred saw the look of longing.
Kira, do you have another gown for the journey?
The eager expression was amusing. The girl shook her head, blushing.
Well, pick one of these. I will not see them in service again.
Kira rushed forward, hardly believing such astonishing generosity. She was about to select a garment from among the wardrobe of a princess. Her eyes fell on a light sun-dyed gown of soft blue. This was the one. She looked up questioningly, her face still a shade darker than usual. Haldred nodded, smiling. How such a small thing could bring so much pleasure to someone at an hour like this. They hurried down the stairs together, laughing for no reason, as excited as two girls on their way to the harvest festival. Malvor seemed excited too, but for very different reasons. He frowned at their apparently flippant demeanor. Imran's orb had already passed its highest point and was descending towards the west. They had to hurry. Two scouts headed out before the long column of refugees. They had to make contact with the men watching Arius and the road north to Varus. Another messenger had been sent to recall the scouts in the east. With any luck, these would be able to avoid Hekan's force heading for Ambrus. Two more men were to remain in the vicinity to report on the movements of Hekan's men. Tregoran marched off at the head of the column. His wife and his daughter were with him, as were several servants, including Maris and Cura and Haldred's son Aryn. Each one carried a pack containing rations and clothing. All the men carried some type of weapon also. Nalvor and 30 picked men brought up the rear. If Hekan's scouts caught up with them, they would not find them defenseless. Not that any confrontation with the raider force could be risked, but the rear guard might be able to buy time for the others to escape beyond its reach. They passed through the open gates of Amrys, flung wide like an astonished mouth, still surprised by the swift violence of the swarm that had passed through here. The silent city behind them was finally desolate, with its last inhabitants departing. All that remained was the looting and fire at the hands of Hekan's men. For Haldred, it was another sad farewell. Her home would be desecrated and befouled, just as Breck had been, and the city of her birth to which they were headed. Ranald faced the room for what he hoped would be the final time. The lords were wavering, though some still seemed undecided. Duke Eald's fiery support of the Inrothians had certainly won the day. As a soldier, he could appreciate the contribution made by the strangers at the Black River and in Aryn Town. There had been nothing half-hearted or treacherous in the way they had spilt their blood and spent their strength on behalf of people who would despise them out of habit. They had not held back when the moment of crisis arrived, but surged forward despite the cost to help win a victory for their neighbors. Such resolve and sacrifice inspired trust.
A show of hands.
His voice was hopeful at last.
All those who believe we should march to Myria as soon as things are settled here.
A quick count confirmed his expectations. Only a small minority remained motionless, mostly northern lords whose lands had been plundered in raids. These would fall in with the rest given the right assurances and a promise of restitution from their newest allies. Gale the Summoner would receive his answer, and the enmity of 600 cycles would be breached at last by the bravery of his men and the timely warning sent to his supposed enemies. Evrain saw the spreading smile of satisfaction on his cousin's face. The transformation begun in Tide when a Viron boy had stumbled into Aryn. The tiny crack in the wall of prejudice that had appeared then had culminated this day in a renewal of an alliance no one could have imagined possible. The lords of Aryn rose together to cheer their king, to grasp one another by the hand. With relief and strong hope they celebrated this victory over the darkness of the past. The sacrifice that had helped save them would be honored and not spurned. The treacherous attack on their homeland would be avenged. The one responsible for their present distress, if not the horrors of the past, would be confronted with his dastardly deeds. There was danger, even though the dark city lay far below him in its shroud of smoky fog. Eyes, hidden in the caverns of the temple, were searching for him. The hooded man was aware of him, even if uncertain of his whereabouts. He was close enough to feel the burning anger of millennia, the terrific thirst for retribution, the consuming jealousy. In his neck the pain started again, and the tight fingers closed round his throat. The streets were alive with shuffling forms. Their spears and armor caught the light of the stars and lamps. Shapes too strange and large to be men, leashed and muzzled, trailed behind their handlers. Towering warriors, red-eyed and armor-clad, waded through the throng. Among these crowding hordes he sensed the altogether different tread of the Loctii, the shifters, from whom even the foul air of Nunmerik recoiled. Their pale human faces wore no expression, for their humanity was long sacrificed for twisted power, and their gaze was empty as their shriveled souls. He turned from them, like every other creature in this maelstrom of malice and threat. He wanted to be out of the streets, the confining mud walls and stinking gutters, to where he could see where they were heading, why they were gathering. A platform had been built in front of the Marsh Lord's palace. The warrior crowd, the beasts and perversions, the men of many worlds filled every street, every rooftop around it, till every structure and yard in the city seemed alive with crawling things, prickling with naked blades and hidden fangs. Pale shapes of long-robed priests stood on the platform, silent and motionless. The fingers tightened round his throat at the sight of them, till he gasped for air. The clamor died down, the seething movement abated. He saw the glimmer of light on the dark steel sea. The host, like a nest of colossal serpents, lay beneath, holding its breath in expectation. It was hungry, potently eager for hurt, finally released from its long concealment to seek out and bring to utter ruin the enemies of its master. Its time had come at last, and he knew suddenly the exultation, the violent joy of the shadow, for the eons of plotting, the humiliations, the grinding defeat and secret hurts were all to be swallowed in triumph. The great cauldron of his hate would boil over into Myro's highways and towns, its lanes and fields, and there would be no place to hide, no refuge for those who would stand against him. The roar of the multitude exploded over the city at the first glimpse of his striding shape. It rose, deafening, suffocating, till the air throbbed in savage waves, and the silence came as he raised his hand. The thrill of control over such assembled might, bringing its own sweet ecstasy. Words came forth in the primitive tongue of untamed regions, impossibly loud, claiming the air above Nunmeric to roll among the stars. It was tenfold as potent as the tearing sounds of the mirror pool, invading his mind with half-comprehended motives and dark emotions so foreign the fear of them was paralyzing. He grew faint and weak at the touch of it, searching for an escape from the threat, and the pulsing cheers, the rousing shouts and clamor faded as he seemed to drift away. Patterns in the sky floated about him. Hints of meaning appeared as the dark music of braying voices below diminished. Lauren's pale eyes were fixed on him, silent and strange, gazing without feeling or opinion, disinterested. To the north loomed the constellation of the Hooded Man, the deceiver of Ligerium, the blind man of Aryn, renamed the dragon's body in Nuria, with its head the former Blade of Stars.
The Headless Man.
The thought was as clear as the night sky above. He knew its originator, and the knowledge brought him back to Myro.
That is what it was named in ancient Veron. The Headless Man, with the Blade of Stars above him. That is his destiny.
The touch from the towers faded abruptly, and he was back on the platform in Lakeside. There was a dark ritual in the making, and again he willed himself away from the place. Yet in horrid fascination he watched the heaving mass of warriors respond. They were about to commence their long march to Nuria and the stricken lands between. Their tents were folded, their carts laden. Malik's great host would march at first light. Screaming filled his ears. On the platform drums were beating madly. He had to escape the place. He had to get away from the strangling hold round his throat, the stabbing in his spine.
Dear, help me.
He was choking, the dark, dank smell of Lakeside dragging him down to the dungeons once more. Someone was shaking him by the shoulders. Voices reached for him, and he opened his eyes to stare at them. The red gaze of the dragon faded to mere embers in the hearth. The tumult in the streets became an urgent call from familiar voices. The grip on his throat disappeared. Gareth gasped for air, his chest heaving. Rune stopped the shaking and gave him some space. Janos lit a torch and brought it close. The men watched concernedly as he recovered his breath. Rune offered him the water skin, and he drank gratefully. Janos spoke to him in low tones.
What was it? Just a dream? Do you have any pain?
He replied with a heavy tongue.
No, not a dream. I was in Lakeside, and I saw what is happening there this night.
Rune stared at him.
Right now? You're sure?
He nodded, flinching as the pain surged through his upper back and neck. Janos leaned over him.
You are hurting.
He grimaced, squinting at the light so close to his eyes.
Where the collar was pinned.
Janos passed the torch to Rune and started removing the cloth round the boy's throat. The back of it was soaked in blood. He turned to Rune and motioned to the torch.
Wedge that thing in a pack and remove the rest of this cloth. I need to get something to put on it.
He crawled over to the fireplace where his jars and gourds littered the floor. Rune found a place for the torch and, turning back, proceeded to undo the last of the bandage. Gareth was trembling now, his eyes staring at the embers in the fireplace. Rune sat down beside him and drew the boy's head onto his chest, ignoring the tiny trickle of blood soaking into his nightshirt.
What did you see?
Gareth sighed deeply before replying.
There are many of them. The shifters. Like the one you saw in the southern woods. The camp in Lakeside is no more. The host is moving out this morning. They were doing things. And he was there. And his hate like a furnace, drawing me in.
He closed his eyes. Rune gripped the shaking shoulders. The boy's voice was small now, tearful.
I was so afraid of him. I cannot be near him. He wants to...
Shh! Forget about it now.
Rune ruffled the boy's hair.
You don't have to go near him. Ever again.
Gareth felt the beating of the heart beneath his cheek and could not bring himself to speak his true fear. The irresistible power of Horan Inronog would claim the life that was so vital and real to him now. If he would be spared the horror of facing that fiend, here was the one who would not. The turning Viron of his dream could not contest such tremendous odds and prevail. He draped his arm across Rune's chest as if to protect the dull beats pulsing there, and tears spilled from his eyes. Janos touched his shoulder and made him sit up. He had a fresh cloth in his hands.
Let me tie up that little hole again. I thought it was healing nicely. What did you do to make it bleed again?
Nothing. I was just dreaming.
Well, try not to dream for a while.
Gareth turned his head to stare at him, incredulous.
I don't do it on purpose. It just happens.
Janos stopped his work to wave a finger at him.
That is a dangerous business. Has no one told you that before?
Gareth did not reply. He remembered Karth's words on Aryn Inrath, so long ago it seemed. But it was no good being told not to do something when he had no inkling how to resist it. The dreams came uninvited, and he was asleep after all. Well, mostly. How could he be blamed? Malik the Undying was on the march. Gareth strongly suspected that there would be little peace for anyone, wakeful or no, while the host of Torellon was abroad.